imagine that it looks like this. That's a rather standard, there's variation, but it's a rather standard fresco in the apse of this church. Right? So the fresco is of the Mother of God holding our Lord Jesus Christ. And the inscription right around her is Mater Theou, Mother of God, famous. So it's the kind of thing that we might imagine that the apostles saw, that the apostles worshipped in that way. So how did we get there, right? How did we get from the left? And yeah, I took a screenshot from The Chosen. This good Holy Week in Lenten streaming service programming, right? They're gathered at table. They're often, if we read the New Testament, they're often at somebody's house at table. Jesus is usually going from one house to another, or going from one place to another, and they're gathered to eat. And here's where, again, what did it mean for them to gather together in one place? The end of each of the Gospels presents us with the risen Lord, Jesus Christ risen from the dead, going to where his apostles are gathered. Right? So every time we say Christ is in our midst, we're saying that because we are the successors to the apostles. We're gathered together in a place, so we believe that the risen Lord is in our midst. At the end of each of the Gospels, the risen Lord Jesus appears. In the Gospel of Luke, he even eats and joins them for breakfast. So how did we get from here on the left to there on the right, that worship experience? And there's a lot of stuff that's kind of crammed in between. Okay, so what we know about gathering at the New Testament. This is the last verse in the Gospel of Luke. It's the very last verse. Right? So when Jesus is ascending into heaven, it says they stayed continually at the temple praising God. So St. Luke is presuming in the stories, in his eyewitness account and in the stories that are circulating in his community, that the apostles are gathering there. That's a reproduction in the Museum of Israel of what the temple looked like before it was destroyed in the year 70, and it was never rebuilt. So they were somewhere in the area of the temple. We know that. And the same author, St. Luke, right? How lucky are we to have access to St. Luke's reporting, who gives us the Gospel of Luke, and also the Acts of the Apostles. Right? Some people call this the fifth Gospel. Says that every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. So they found some area, if we can imagine, within that confine, and as much as a reproduction can inform us, to get together to do whatever it was that they were going to do. And the Acts of the Apostles tells us that they gathered together, that they prayed, that they sang hymns, and that they took a collection. They took a collection to help the poor and the needy. It also says in chapter 2 that they shared everything in common. Acts chapter 2 became kind of like a blueprint for church renewal in the 20th century. Not that it ever wasn't a blueprint for what the church should look like, but to hold all things in common and to share everything that one has and to gather together in a place. Right? What we don't see here is any evidence of building a church and what that church might look like. The apostles gathered together in a place. So if we go back two of his disciples to go and to get a room. Kind of like us making a dinner reservation now. If you want to have, say, geez, what am I going to do? I'm going to have a group of 50. Well, maybe they'll scatter outside, or maybe they'll rent our church hall here, or maybe they'll go to Stacks in Valpo. I don't know, right? But they have to find a place to gather for food, to eat food, to share a meal together. So one of the things that we know from the apostolic era, right, we don't know exactly when this stopped, was that when they gathered together after Jesus had ascended into heaven, they had dinner and then they had Eucharist in that order. After supper, they would have Eucharist. And then at some point, fairly early on, that supper the Eucharist itself became detached from the community meal that they were having together. Okay, so we've got the temple, and then the temple's destroyed in 70 AD and it's never rebuilt. So the temple was the focal point of Jewish worship. People would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to go to the temple. We know in the New Testament we read that Jesus himself goes for certain feasts. Right? The Apostle Paul goes for certain feasts. In his letters, we hear about this. We hear about this in the Acts of the Apostles. And it's destroyed in the year 70. So then the apostles gathered at synagogues. Right? And sometimes we conflate those terms today. If we have Jewish friends, they might say, well, I went to temple. Or I have temple on Friday night, or I have temple on Saturday. But the temple, the actual temple, was destroyed in 70 AD, and it had a serious epic effect on Jewish life and on Jewish customs. Because what happened at the temple was that the priest would perform a sacrifice. Right? So we know, for example, the sacrifices that were performed on the Day of Atonement. And that would be the one time of the year that the priest would go into the Holy of Holies in the temple. And only the high priest was allowed to go there. So the priest would perform this sacrifice on behalf of the people. But at the same time that people would go to the temple, they also had synagogues. And so there's some question, and Jewish scholars are asking, well, what were they doing in the synagogues? Because Christians who were the successors to Jews, the new Israel, considering themselves the people of God in continuity with the Old Testament, they had to have a place to gather. And so there's evidence that they gathered at synagogues. The word synagogue just means to assemble. It was a place for Jewish people to get together. And scholars tell us that synagogues were multifunctional. They were used not only for worship or for prayer. In fact, there's a question of whether or not the Jews actually prayed in the synagogue. There's evidence suggesting that they did, but when you get into the academic field and you don't have a lot of evidence, people are kind of hesitant to say, we know for sure that they did this. We know that they read the scriptures in the synagogue, for sure. We don't know if they also offered prayers. There is evidence that suggests that. So in the temple, we had these sacrifices that were performed. There was the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, the ark that contained the tablets where the finger of God wrote down the Ten Commandments, right? And if you do enough internet digging, you might see a very interesting claim that is made by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that they have the original Ark of the Covenant. And their worship in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is different than our Eastern Orthodox tradition because they observe certain Jewish practices. They've actually retained some of them. We've got one Oriental Orthodox Church that does that. Different topic. You're not my students at the university, so I'm not going to give you a quiz on that after this. But it's an interesting, the Ark of the Covenant was the focal point. In fact, synagogues, when they were built, were oriented towards the location of the temple. because the temple was the presence of God. Right? Particularly, the Ark of the Covenant was the presence of God. And when that was taken away, it had an epic effect on the Jewish community because they didn't have priests anymore. Right? So then the Jewish community came to be ruled by a rabbi. And a rabbi is not the same thing as a priest, not performing sacrifices. But perhaps most importantly, a rabbi is mostly somebody who knows the law. Very knowledgeable on those 614 commandments that the Jews had to keep. And therefore, the rabbi taught and read the scripture and preached, but also served as a judge and an arbiter in the community, all the way through until today. To become a rabbi, you have to become an expert in Jewish law. Similar to the Islamic imam, which essentially is someone who's knowledgeable about Islamic law. Not the same as what we do. Because as priests or presbyters, we preside over a bloodless sacrifice of the Eucharist. Okay, so no more priests. So at the synagogue, it existed at the same time as the temple did, and then continued to exist afterwards. Right? And so we know that Christians gathered there. And here's where things, I think, can get kind of interesting. There's evidence of the public reading of scriptures, right, aloud. Jesus himself, in the Gospel of Luke, goes into the synagogue and reads from the prophet of Isaiah. Right? And it even says, as was the custom. And he opened the book. So there was a place somewhere, right? You had to have access. This tells us quite a bit. This claim that's made in the Gospel of Luke, by St. Luke. It tells us quite a bit about what Jewish worship looked like. First, it tells us that Jesus knew how to read. Can't take that for granted. Someone had taught him how to read the Hebrew that was inscribed in the scroll that would be given to him to read from. This also means that they had to have a place to maintain the scroll. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. They couldn't pull it up on a phone. Right? Similar to where we have to have a book, which always gets kind of funny. I think sometimes it's like, I forgot my book today. So thankfully we have a whole bunch of other copies sometimes that we can take from. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 5, Jesus refers to Pharisees enjoying praying in the synagogues, that they like to be seen while they're praying. So that's evidence to us that they probably were praying in the synagogue along with reading from the scripture. And you could get deep into the weeds of, what does that mean, historically speaking? But it tells us about something about what was happening at the synagogue. And the synagogue prayer was directed toward the temple. So there are focal points. There are like focal points early on in Jewish and also in Christian worship. The structure itself was supposed to be designed in such a way to face a certain direction. It's kind of like a teaser. Every church, not just Orthodox, but technically every church is supposed to be on an eastward axis. Right? Because paradise is east of Eden, and that is our destination. That's why when we consult with architects, we say the altar has to be facing east, so that the whole congregation, when they pray, is facing the same way and facing east. Now, what's really interesting here, and this comes from an archaeological dig that was done, the very oldest evidence that they could find in Galilee from archaeological digs, was that the synagogues had two platforms. So think of like an elevated platform that you would have to go up some steps to stand on. That would house the Torah scroll in an ark. So even though they had lost the Ark of the Covenant, they were in continuity with their temple tradition, now housing the Torah scroll, right? So that they could perform the commandments that God had given them, that they could fulfill those obligations. So these bimas, these elevated platforms, are something that Christians will. So that's an example you see there, the rabbi reading from the scriptures, or actually he is not reading the scriptures, I'm sorry. He is reciting the Haggadah. And the Haggadah is the story of the Passover. It's a really cool Jewish tradition. I've never actually seen it, but I've had to teach it, where the eldest person in the family tells the story of what God did on that night to the children who are seated at the table to the best of his ability. So here, obviously this is 14th century, we're long after the apostolic era, but when I was searching for images, I thought that this captured the notion of being elevated. So, for example, if you've ever been at Valpost Chapel at the university, or at a Protestant church where you have to climb up a staircase to a pulpit, this is basically the archetype of what the pulpit became. In fact, in the book that I was using to prepare this, the author said this is essentially a Jewish pulpit, a bima. Right? And we see this scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, these bimas, in these structures and what it remains of them. So this is something that came to be passed on to Christians so that ministers, including bishops and deacons, would stand on the bima on an elevated spot so that they could perform their ministry, almost certainly so that they would have a way to project their voice. But the elevation, the focal point, where you are in the structure permits your voice to carry a little bit further. It's actually designed that way. So here we see Jewish design that's beginning to influence, it will eventually influence Christian design, because Christians were already gathering in the synagogues. You're already doing that. Okay. So, where did they go? The earliest Christians went to synagogues, and they also went to houses. So the original, and there's not much evidence, right? But in the apostolic era, there were many gatherings, small groups, in homes, the Domus Ecclesiae, or what is sometimes known as the house church. When I was reading, up on this, the author kept saying over and over again, be careful of the assumptions that you make about what they did at the house church. Because what you need to imagine is this scenario where there's a group of, say, 15, I'm just making this number up, that wants to get together for dinner and for prayer. And who do we know in the group that can host a big enough but it's not the Roman Empire yet, so the Christian community itself was pretty small. So really in the teens, maybe up to 20, usually a room around the third floor of a house is where they would gather together, because then they could open a window and a breeze would come through, and you would be able to sit for a long time at a Mediterranean-style meal where you're having a few bottles of wine and a lot of conversation, and then it ends with the Eucharist, with the rite of the Eucharist. The room that was in this upper part of the house was called a triclinium, right? That will be on the test. Only one person left. And so the oldest examples that we have from the apostolic era are called title or titular churches, which means that they had a patron. These were people who had means. In particular in Rome, a lot of the evidence of these titular churches come from Rome, but they were people of means, people who had homes that could accommodate gatherings and had employees, people who worked for them, servants who could help to host the dinner, where the person who was the head of the household, his job was also to kind of run the household. Right? And that person's title was episkopos, an overseer of a household, which is where we get the title for bishop, a person who is an overseer. Sometimes the word that we use is called pater familias, right? The father of the house. To separate and distinguish Christian worship is that from the very earliest evidence that we have, the only people that were permitted in the Christian gatherings for Eucharist were people who had been baptized. That stipulation is in a church manual that was written for early bishops that's called the Didache. It is one of the oldest non-scriptural sources. I think it is the oldest non-scriptural source we have available to us. And it says in there, only the baptized are permitted to participate in the Eucharist. Right? Somewhat later than the Didache is a testimony from a man named Justin Martyr, who also says only baptized Christians were permitted to participate in the rite of the Eucharist. And he goes into such detail as to include an explanation and a description of how they baptize people. So, if you were going to baptize people in your community, you had to have a place to baptize them. And in my head now, I've got this film clip from my big fat Greek wedding where they blow up the kiddie pool and they fill it with water, which is actually still done, right? Still done. But what the early VIP, and the VIP is you have to be baptized. Pretty clear from the beginning. I just came from a conference where someone said, well, we permit people to receive Holy Communion now before they're baptized. Another topic. Okay, so kind of the big takeaway from this is that the buildings eventually that evolve, that bubble up, that Christians begin to construct when they're able to, they're based on what they need to do, right? It's not a pre-established blueprint. We don't have from the apostles, here, you can host Eucharist, here's a blueprint for what it's supposed to look like. They really were innovative in how they use space And eventually the space was based on what do we need to do in the place that we're at. I imagine that because we know that households of Christians were baptized, that their kids needed a place to play. Right? I don't know what games they did, but maybe you do. Right? So here's another example, and it's not the easiest thing to see, but this is one of the oldest examples of another excavation of this time a Christian edifice. The name of it is Dura Europos, but it's actually a Syrian structure, and it was underground. And if you go into the tempting thing of, well, I'm going to go look that up online, you're going to be overwhelmed with the amount of information that there is. But this structure gives us a sense of how this evolution occurred. So it looks like when they gathered for their ritual of the Eucharist, they gathered here in the assembly hall. This is where they came in. See steps going in. They actually had a space that was dedicated for baptisms, a baptistry here. Okay? And here is kind of a hard to see the remnants of what's left of the baptismal font. This is one of the earliest indications that we have of paintings or frescoes, iconography, in the baptistry of Dura Europos. Right? And then there's a courtyard. So similar to the evidence that we saw at the end of the Gospel of Luke, that they were gathered together in the courts of the temple. So the courtyard was a place to mingle, to walk, to take a break, depending on how the time was structured. So you see kind of an early example here in Dura Europos, very famous. One of the things that I looked everywhere for this and I couldn't find it, but it had a bema. And so, and when you look at it, it's just kind of hard to see in the actual images, so I decided not to include it. But it's evidence of a Christian community having a designated space for the ministers to lead prayer, an elevated space. And so that's one of the most important things that we see from the very beginning. But here, and I kind of get excited thinking about it, we see really early historical evidence of Christians determining we need to do this, so where are we going to put fixtures in a space where we gather? So that's an actual photo of the baptistry, and there's a very detailed description of, and I can't match up to what the actual frescoes are. There are more frescoes than just those, but they include David having a sword, having defeated Goliath. And so the idea, and this was like a huge, when I read this, I got chills all over, because I'm trained in liturgy and I'm a nerd on this stuff. The earliest Christians did chrismation before baptism. And so what we do now is actually a rather later development, but right before you would be baptized, you would be chrismated with holy mirror. In fact, that goes all the way to the 5th century. St. John Chrysostom describes chrismation happening before they would be baptized. Now, why it got switched, there's a whole lot of debate on it, but there's evidence here indicating in the iconography that they were chrismating, they were anointing before they went into the baptismal font. It's particularly prominent in Syria, in the Syrian sources. There is also a fresco of the apostles in a ship, and of Jesus and St. Peter walking on water. And there's also a fresco of Jesus healing the paralytic from the Gospel of St. Mark in chapter 2. So you have all of these themes, right, coming together. And now I'll give you a little quiz. What do you think the significance is of them painting, of having those frescoes in the baptistry?
People knew what happened, so people would know what happened. Maybe everybody didn't read, so the pictures told the story.
Precisely. Yeah. We assume literacy. I always throw this to my students. I'm like, why are pictures so important? Right, because the pictures told the story that they would then use vocally to pass on to them. Because the literacy rate, that was for the elite who had access to that kind of education. Oh, I forgot to mention the myrrh-bearing women. So the idea was that when you were being baptized, you were being anointed like Christ. Right? And Christ is the fulfillment of the line of David. So this is going to kind of wrap up what I wanted to present, and then I thought we could just talk a little bit about it. But just in terms of initial conclusions and thinking of this as one of what I hope will be four. Right? And the next one will be fun because if I can get the videos to work, the 3D videos, they send chills down my spine. And I'll say more about that after if you want. But we know that the temple was a focal point for gathering and that synagogues were also important meeting places. We know that the synagogue kind of replaced the function of Jewish and also Christian worship, because the word synagogue, again, just means assembly, a place to assemble. After the destruction of the temple in the year 70. One of the most important points is we know that what we're doing as a community determines what kind of a space we need and how we're going to arrange it. So interior design is going to become super important. It's going to become super important for Christians. So basically you need to have a space that can accommodate the crowd that you need for a table, for the rite of the Eucharist, and eventually for baptism. And we see this need evolving quickly because as soon as the Christians decided that only you needed a baptismal, you needed to be baptized to be permitted to participate, I can't emphasize enough just how tightly knit this was. Justin Martyr says that they were so hyper aware of who was present and who was absent that they would, at every Eucharistic assembly, send the deacons out to those who had been absent from the Eucharist so that they could partake of Holy Communion. So like one of the small details that we could talk about if we want is that there's plenty of evidence in early Christians that people would take communion at home with them. And they would have a little bit of it throughout the week. Right? So that's part of the origins of our liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts. And there's evidence of evolution. So where I'm going with this is that the bema eventually becomes an ambo and a pulpit for us. Our early churches, many of them had separate baptistries. Constructing a baptistry, a space that's designated just for baptisms, that has access to running water, is something that is returning to Christian practice today. Right? It really was big in the 60s and in the 70s of the previous century. And I've seen a few Orthodox churches in the United States that have a baptistry. So for example, St. Nicholas OCA, or OCA Church in Portland, has a baptistry that can accommodate both an infant and also an adult. So part of where we're going on the left there is a place I haven't been to, but it's it's one of the earliest examples that we have of a baptistry that's in a separate building. And it's in Italy at a time where this part of Italy was ruled, part of the Byzantine Empire. It's in Ravenna. And so you'll notice that this is a separate building. It's part of the larger structure. So it's octagonal. And baptistries tended to be built in an octagonal form. When I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago, I went to St. John Lateran Church, which was one of the papal basilicas, and it was a real bummer because it was closed. But the baptistry was open, and they were having a service in the baptistry, and it was octagonal, filled with iconography. And the priest that was with me, and I was just kind of like in awe of having a separate baptistry. Quite common in Christian cities that have a long history. On the right there is an attempt to reproduce, as part of a 3D program, the Christian successor to the Bema, which is the Ambo and Hagia Sophia. And I have actual photos of the Ambo of Hagia Sophia that I'll eventually share. But the Ambo was in the middle of the church, and when they would do the great entrance, they would bring the gifts up and down those steps. The chanters would sing from there. Although most of the bishops didn't preach from the Ambo, or the successor to the Bema, although legend tells us that St. John Chrysostom preached from the Ambo because his voice wasn't strong enough, and he also wanted to make sure that people were paying attention, which he says rather crankily very frequently in his sermons. But this is part of a real expansion that we will eventually see. One of the things that I wanted to talk about that I'll just kind of end with is that a lot of Christian communities, Orthodox Christian communities, gather where they can. So particularly in times of, say, during the Soviet Union, people would gather in a house, they would worship on a ship, they would go to an isolated place in a forest. So the primary fixture of Christian architecture is the people. It's the people. I think that's pretty much it. So that is it.
How big was that place, the one that had the separate courtyard, and how big was that?
I didn't bring my book with me, so the Duriropos.
Yeah.
He's asking about Duriropos.
Duriropos, yeah. I didn't see off the top of my head.
That's an actual place.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bigger than a room, bigger than a house church. So it's an expanded house church. But there were also examples of basilicas that are just a little bit later than Duriropos, which are much, much larger. And I'll talk about that hopefully in the next time that we have. But this would be bigger than somebody's expanded courtyard. So I think I'd have to go back, and I intended to bring my book and I neglected to do that. But if I recall correctly, there's a difference between a house church where the host is saying, "Come to my house," and they still live there, and a house church that is then converted into a community space. And I think Duriropos is one of the first examples of someone's home that then becomes a community's. Like the community then, it's their, essentially they're using the whole space for all of their purposes. But I don't know the dimensions of the town. I can find out.
I just wondered.
A Google search would probably be
bigger than I had thought, because I've read about that place before. But seeing the photo of the baptistry, it was a lot bigger than I imagined.
Yeah, same.
That it would have been. And then when you think about that room, which we saw the photo of on that floor plan, it's a pretty big complex, actually. Again, without knowing what the square footage would have been, but it looked big to me, that the baptistry. Yeah.
With respect to the dedicated baptistry, which, in the history of the church, there wouldn't be deaconess, right? And was part of that having a separate baptistry privacy concern? How would that affect the practice itself?
So I think having the separate baptistry was actually, from the evidence that we have, we find it all over Christian geography, really in what we would define as the late antique era, So this is a pretty early example of having a baptistry that's separate from the main meeting space. But most of the examples that we have, even in now ruined churches in northern Africa, were of baptistries that were separate. They were connected to, they were part of the complex. But I think that it's because it was such an important part of the community's life, is to have a space that was dedicated just for that. It also seems to be a way of teaching people that becoming Christian is a gradual process. So you don't go into the church right away, right? You meet at a certain spot to receive instruction and to do prayers. If you meet in one of the churches, you're told to leave. So the things that we say in the liturgy that we don't actually do, if you see in the book, like where it says depart catechumens, there would be a point where they would be dismissed and told to leave. But one of the reasons for having a baptistry would be when they were baptized, so that they could go from that place into the larger space, and then you'd have a ritual moment, really like the only time you would do this in your life, where now you have joined the community completely. And so when they would do it on feasts like Pascha or Pentecost, it would be a rather dramatic moment. The evidence that we have is that there were deaconesses who assisted with the women and helped them and performed the anointing of the women when they would be baptized. But I think that the baptistry itself was to accommodate larger groups of people because households were coming in for baptism. So kind of the question of, did Christians always baptize infants? We see pretty early on that whole households were going for baptism. And it's also in the 2nd and the 3rd century where we see bishops who are saying that defending infant baptism. So it's larger groups of people, so it's to accommodate enough of a group of people, and to have a font that's large enough so that both the minister and the person or people who are being baptized and anointed can be in the water. So, later on I'll show a more elaborate design of what the baptistry looked like, but you have, steps that descend and ascend from the font. So basically the minister has to be in the water to make sure that the person is immersed when they're baptized.
So I guess to follow up, I had the impression that Sergei was asking about baptism in the nude being a thing that they were worried about and having to work around. But you're suggesting that, as you're talking though, it also becomes clear to me, something I hadn't thought about before, that you also just have the problem of plumbing.
Yeah.
Because, we take plumbing for granted, but most buildings did not have running water. And so, to install running water into an existing space, especially, let's say, if you wanted to fill, like we do, a baptismal font right in the middle of your sanctuary, very impractical. Because hoses don't exist yet, right, which is how we do it, And you don't, have pipes running through the middle of the room to accommodate that, right? So you're filling buckets somewhere. But, yeah, the bigger rooms, the bigger baptismal fonts that I've seen, from antiquity, they arrange for it that water is actually coming into the building right there, and that would be like why it's in the corner, for example, of the building, because the water would be coming from the outside to fill the font. And in some of the more elaborate ones, it's set up so that it's running constantly, like it fills up and then at a certain point it empties out, because the preference was to be baptized in running water, like you were in a river, basically. And of course, running water is cleaner, so maybe it's a very practical concern. Yeah. Anyway, but that would be just as big of an issue. Is how do we get the water in a way, in a place where, like you say, we can actually baptize adults, several people at once. But I don't know. I know of some evidence that baptism in the nude was was normal, at least in some places, sometime. But do we know how widespread that was, or whether it was a strict thing for so long? Like, was that a very big consideration?
The only thing that I recall from that, I mean, there are sources to look at. The other Syrian church orders have more details on what the deaconesses did. It seems that the deaconesses performed the anointing, because the original anointings were, what we do now is symbolic, but the anointings were a whole body. You'd be rubbing the oil all over the person, right? And so to have, it would be one thing to have the bishop or the chief priest immerse their head under water. It would be another thing to actually apply the chrism to the whole body. So that, I know, is one issue that's come up with deaconesses. But the rest of it, I'd have to check some of the church orders, and there's not a ton of evidence. There's some, but there's not like a lot. And there's no, we're kind of grasping at, we know that they were appointed to this task, but it doesn't, there is, I believe, a reference, 4th century, that does say for propriety purposes, like the deaconesses perform this.
I remember at seminary reading a source from Rome that I think was like from the 5th or 6th. I mean, it was a little bit later. That described baptism.
Apostolorum contains it, one of the Syrian church orders. But I don't want to promise you that, sorry. So.
Partially it's curious because also, the icon of theophany, Christ is depicted, there was a controversy.
That's true, yes.
So, does the church always look at it like that? Or?
In terms of the iconography? Is that what you mean? Or?
I don't know that Christ was baptized that way.
Oh. Well, as far as I know, the presumption is that yes, baptism was naked. But I don't actually know what support there is for that. That's just what I've heard. So,
definitely have evidence from 4th century sources when bishops are meeting with people to explain to them the meaning of baptism and referring to them as naked like Adam and Eve, and also with reference to Christ on the cross. Because baptism is paschal, and it takes on that paschal, really, so theophany and Pascha come together. They already have a connection. So basically, two things. Every person who's baptized is like Christ, and that Christ is anointed by the Holy Spirit and revealed as Christ at theophany. So that is the significance of being anointed with chrism, to have that chrismation done on you, whether it happened before or after baptism. It's in the image of Christ's theophany. The paschal image of crucifixion, of dying with Christ in the water. Numerous sermons refer to them being completely naked, stripping all the clothing off, and saying that you're putting off the old man. This Pauline imagery of putting off the old man and of
being clothed in the new.
Yeah, and no shame in the nakedness. Mm-hmm. So the nakedness is prepping you to put on Christ. All of which is evidence that they were naked. And if you obviously we don't do that.
Right.
Unless it's an infant.
Some of it's cultural though too. I mean, in the ancient Roman world, nudity was just not that uncommon.
Right. In many cultures.
I mean, like the public restrooms, for example, were just open. Like you would just drop your drawers and sit on a thing, and you would be right next to a bunch of other guys. Now they were, I believe they were, differentiated by sex, but there weren't like walls. I mean, like you were just, and if you went to work out in the gymnasium, you did it naked, in front of everybody. And there again, like we're all just naked in the sun. I mean, It wasn't that uncommon. But certainly for a man to put his hands on a naked woman was completely, not allowed. And that's why, again, the office of deaconess was at least one of the roles that we believe that they had, was to assist with the baptisms of women so that The clergy wouldn't be touching them and probably wouldn't even see them naked. Like, again, the one source that I remember reading talked about like the deaconesses would hold up sheets or blankets or something, right, to shield the view of the male clergyman who was reading the prayers. But anyway.
Question. So we don't really have deaconesses anymore? Is that where the nuns kind of like fill that role for in certain aspects? Because we don't have deaconesses because they were necessary.
No, we don't. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the nuns have performed some of those roles, but I think basically the way that I see it is that what the deacons used to do, all of them, deacons and deaconesses, evolved. And the reason for that, I mean, there's a number of reasons for it, but the main reason that comes to mind for me is that when Hagia Sophia, which had a whole roster, there was one point in history where the church in Constantinople had a list of presbyters, an archdeacon, over 100 deacons, and then several dozen deaconesses, subdeacons, and even doorkeepers. It'd be a fun job, to be the doorkeeper. Say, get out, they said depart now, catechetical. So. And it was a big, like when we look at the architecture, well, in the 4th century, we'll talk a little bit more about why they needed a chancel barrier. That then was kind of the forerunner to the iconostasis, to have a structure that separated the altar area from, because it's a public space, right? So all of which is to say that at a certain an undetermined amount of time in some kind of a program of prayer, ritual, lecture, interviews, very intense fasting, exorcisms said over them rather frequently. That catechumenate begins to show signs of decline already in the 4th century. And by the 6th century, it's almost completely gone. So by the 6th century, we don't really have that many adults being baptized anymore, but it's now just infants. So it's really for that reason that the deacon's role becomes initially more ceremonial, right? So once that starts to happen, this kind of very intense interaction with people who are preparing for baptism starts to disappear, which is the other reason why you don't have as many baptistries built, because now you just need a small font for an infant. It was when missionaries began to go out into unchristianized places in the 19th and 20th centuries that non-Orthodox churches, but also some Orthodox churches, identified a need to have a baptistry, to have a dedicated space for it. Or what we would, the kind of conversation I would think that a church would have now would be to have a discussion of where should we put a font that could accommodate adult and infant baptism. There are actually some pretty creative fonts that I've seen that have been constructed that have like a smaller version of it on top, and then a larger version on the bottom, so that you could do both an infant and adult baptism. But it's because the catechumenate, the whole process itself, began to disappear from the life of the church. Yeah, it's what we call organic development. Their deacons were needed. When they would give communion, the deacon would always give communion to the people from the chalice. So that went on until like the 10th century. And many of the chalices were ceramic and they were heavy. And so to hold them required physical strength. They didn't even introduce a spoon. The introduction of a spoon wasn't until the 9th century. Right? So, too much detail, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, I have a question. Why do they think that is in Ethiopia? Is it, I mean, I read some about that a while ago. Is it sitting there?
It's supposedly in their main cathedral. And they claim it's, so this is all about, and maybe you know more about this, Father Jacob, but I think that this is all about this kind of an ancient Christian tradition. It's actually across religions of various groups making claims that they have the oldest and most holy relics. So there have been many claims made about who has the cross of Christ. You know, we have a whole feast dedicated to the what was originally the dedication of a church, and which kind of became the elevation of the cross when Constantine and some other Helen found it. And then they erected it right there in Jerusalem, and there's this whole conversation about catechumens, people who are preparing, meeting at the cross and venerating the cross. So I think that's what this is all about, is making the claim. I don't know the details of how the Ethiopians came to possess the Ark of the Covenant. I do know that this is not like a laughing matter for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This is like really serious business. And their architecture is designed. Every Ethiopian church has a replica of the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And has a curtain that therefore conceals it. So for them, it's like super serious.
Yeah, well, what I have read, and I watched some documentary about this too many years ago. Maybe it was like 60 Minutes or something.
It was 60 Minutes, yeah.
There are a number of clergy whose job it is to serve at that place and to care for the ark and also protect it, but they don't permit others to just come in and look. So, there's no pictures, but I mean, these people will tell you, yeah, I see it every day. I mean, I presume there's something there that they believe is the ark, right? Now, how sure are we that it really is the ark? I couldn't tell you, right? Or how it got there. I don't even know that there is an agreed upon account of how it arrived in Ethiopia in the first place. But according to them, it's been there for well over 2,000 years, because it actually disappeared from the temple in Jerusalem long before that temple was destroyed in 70 AD. When the temple was destroyed in 70, the ark wasn't there. And even Jewish sources do not agree about when it vanished or how. It's very mysterious.
Yeah.
So, but there are other stories about where it went, apart from the claim of the church in Ethiopia. I don't know of anyone else who claims that they have it, but I've heard a Jewish source, or there are Jewish sources that tell a story of when this temple was under siege at some point, that a group of priests decided to hide it in catacombs dug under the temple and sealed it off, and died and sealed it off with themselves inside to protect it, and it just hasn't been found. You know what I mean? There are all kinds of different stories that float around, but that's all I know.
Yeah, exactly. And really, I think what is interesting about that is, and it's something that I think is transferable to what we do in churches. For example, one of the things that kind of happens in the next phase of architecture is that Christians go to the graves of saints and start to celebrate Eucharist on the grave. And that becomes the altar. That having an altar, what used to be a dining table, and that was a huge debate in the 20th century, is the altar a dining table, or is it a tomb, or is it a womb? And, you have kind of all these words that are used to describe what the altar is, and then ultimately some pretty smart people say, well, it's all of those things. it's not, one doesn't annul the other. Next kind of form of architectural form. And so what we have now is every altar, there's a relic either installed somewhere in the table itself, and also it's sewn into what we call instead of the altar, the cloth that we have on top that authorizes us to have a divine liturgy in all of our parishes. Here's why I say this. You have to get the relics from somewhere. And it comes from either pilgrimage, people who had the means to travel to places to get stuff, or more often, it comes from gifts. And the process is called transfer of relics. So as a goodwill sign, one church will give the gift of, here's a piece of the saint, bring it home to your community, and then you can adopt our beloved patron saint, and they can become your saint as well, which is really how we have relics of saints in all of our churches, is through this process of gift giving. But it really comes about, I think, from people ending up in a certain place and saying, look at what I have. Look at what I brought home. What I brought with me. Or, very sadly, and this gets us really deep into the weeds of Christians not getting along together, but when something is taken. And then, several hundred years later, then you have a pope saying, we're really sorry that 800 years ago we took this from these relics of St. John Chrysostom, so now we're going to give them back. So it's that, but that's kind of how that happens. But like you said, I don't know if anyone knows for sure. Maybe there's someone in Ethiopia who knows the story, but I don't.
I mean, even then, how could they know that it's true? Right? I mean, like so many things that are so ancient, it's like we have the story that's been told for centuries, but is there any way to independently verify that? I mean, you just can't, right? Yeah.
Difficult issue.
Yeah. Well,
remember the weeping icon at Cicero? I think they basically said, no, we're not going to buy into somebody coming in here and taking this apart, so was it ever authenticated?
I don't actually know.
No, I don't think so, because I think, the church said, no, it's our miracle, basically, we believe that, and that's enough for us, we don't need, to have it proved, and plus, to prove it, you would have to be disrespectful to, so, you'd have to do stuff to it which would not be good, so maybe.
The church likes to oversee that process when it can. I really don't know much more about the Ark of the Covenant than that, to be honest. I mean, obviously in the Hebrew scriptures, it's a very big deal.
Right, no, I read about that.
I think it's interesting that it's such that they have. Yes, no, it's very interesting. Holy of Holies, to have a space. And the source that I was reading for this, some of the Jewish art that's on synagogues that they date back to similar eras, is really interesting to learn about what they were depicting in art, right? Like menorahs. How you have to have the Talmud that has a container that's considered to be sacred. Torah, sorry, not Talmud, in the synagogue. So, kind of interesting intersection, maybe some cross-pollination.
Is there a way that your presentation can be attached to an email, like maybe you can email it to somebody who may not want to Google every slide?
Sure.
Thank you.
I could do that. Question is, do you want the PowerPoint or do you want the PDF? The PDF will be smaller. Okay.
It'll be on YouTube shortly, too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's live.
Oh, geez. Hi.
You know, this is kind of off topic a little bit, but, you know, it would be really nice for someone to go through our iconography in the church and, like, tell us all about it. Like, I know there's a lot of things and all of that, you know, and I was thinking of it more for the kids, just not, I mean, I would like it too, but because when I was Catholic, and when I left the Catholic Church, I went to a Protestant church, and one of the things that I missed so much when I left the Catholic Church, even as young as I was, like I left when I was in 6th grade because they wouldn't let my mom take communion, you know, because she got divorced, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember was like the Stations of the Cross, that you know, those things really spoke to me as a child because you could see it. You could see what was happening, and I remember the priest at my church going around and explaining, you know, the significance of each station and all of that, and you know, then you prayed the Stations of the Cross, you know, but like the icons in our church now, like I don't know what some of them really mean, all of them.
Well,
you know,
yeah.
and I'm not obviously not well educated so on this, but and maybe more people are than I am, but I know like my grandkids, and I think it would be really cool to just like have somebody maybe one icon a Sunday, like, you know, take some time to explain, you know, the icon.
I think
What
that's
it's depicting.
really important. You know, I wrote a book about 12 years ago where I profiled 4 Orthodox churches in the United States. And that was the most important part of the story, was how do the things that are really important to a specific community express their story of who they are. So for example, we have the inscription on the front of our church when you walk in and you see the name of the priest. You have the arrangement of the cemetery chapel. The icons themselves, a lot of these icons have stories of how people came to bring them and then install them here. You know, where did they get the icon? What region of the world is it from? Does it have some kind of a story in their family? So for example, that church that I showed in the very beginning, Holy Virgin Cathedral in San Francisco, there's a story of their iconographer who over a period of 9 summers painted the icons throughout the church. And it's like a tapestry of Old Testament and New Testament stories. But they also have in the church relics that were brought from people that were related to Tsar Nicholas II and the royal family. So you can go and venerate some of these relics because they were made saints by the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, I think in 1981 or 82. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's one of those 2 years. They also have a shrine in that church to St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco. And so people come in to venerate the shrine. But, you know, all of these things tell a much bigger story that is all about the community. And every church is like that. So there's a pretty famous church in Milwaukee. It's actually in a suburb of Milwaukee. It's Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church. And it's occasionally the butt of jokes because people say, oh, it's the spaceship church. Because it like has this kind of, it's an unusual shape. It looks like a ship. The reason it looks like that is because they were trying to make it look like the dome of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople. So the church itself is supposed to look like a dome. But like one of the things that you don't know unless you go in is that if you go into the basement of the church, it did then, I don't know if it still does, had a chapel that consisted of all of the original icons and iconostasis from their old church. So they preserved that, and it was in the basement. And so it was kind of like walking through the church, getting the history of the people, where they came from, what region of Greece they came from, similar to Holy Virgin Cathedral. The people of that church, 80% of them came from Harbin in China. They were Russian Orthodox Christians who were in China, in Harbin, who went from Harbin to Western Europe and ultimately settled in San Francisco. And at the time, their priest said that 80% of the people who are, parishioners in this church have some connection to Harbin. But most of the people that we actually get are people who aren't members, who come to San Francisco or want to attend this church because they're coming here to venerate the relics of St. John. So those factors are like uber important. So if there's a story that people know about these icons, it would be worthwhile to use the tech that we have to maybe start a parish project, right? And I'm not saying I'm going to lead it, but to do like a catalog or an inventory. What are these icons? Where are they from? How did they get here? Who are the family members who brought them here? That would become like a part of a parish history that I think would be very rich.
And I mean, that is like ultimately, yes. But even just the more simplistic, what is this depicting?
Yeah.
And all the different things in it, because people that aren't cradle Orthodox, I don't know these things. Like, I don't look at some of the icons and I don't even know what they are, some of them. And, like I simply would just be like a child when it comes to like just walking around and telling me what all these things mean, because I don't know, and I think it would just be so good for the children, because as a Catholic, like those Stations of Christ, there's certain things I remember that made me feel close to God, that really spoke to me, and like the Stations of Christ were one of them. There were other things, but I even went back to the Catholic Church as a Protestant just to do the Stations of the Cross, just because it meant so much to me, And I think if the kids maybe like, had like an overview of the different icons and stuff like that, that they would mean more to them. I know it would to me. Now I know other people probably know more about it than I do, because they've been here or they're canonical. They've been Orthodox their whole life. But it's my thing. I don't know it, and you don't want to just say, well, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. And here's just to kind of take what you're talking about. This is the kind of thing that I think we take for granted, is that early Christians, their imagery and frescoes were used, but not to the degree that we do it now. So even in Hagia Sophia, it was pretty sparsely decorated. There is iconography, but it was more limited. It wasn't until they had an iconoclastic controversy and the people who believed that venerating icons was good and holy and necessary won, that they started to fill the entire space of the church with icons. So,
because some of the older, like Holy Trinity, is sparse. It's not, as busy as ours, or the Cathedral of Holy Resurrection in up in Chicago. That's icon. There's an icon everywhere. There's one space that's not filled.
I've been in Orthodox churches that have very few, a lot of like bare space in the walls, and I actually think it's because their communities didn't come from places that you had icons everywhere. But like another point to think about, and we can stop whatever you guys want, but
Most of us are about 550.
okay. So this will be the last thing that I'll say. We cannot assume that every Christian community had the financial means to, or the talent to have an iconographer, right? So here's an example. When I took a group of students to Lviv, Ukraine in 2016, where they had a museum that contained some of the oldest Ukrainian icons, 14th century, pretty old for them, right? And they did a workshop where we painted an icon in an hour, each one of us. And the whole point of it was, how do villages create iconography? They have a pattern, and then you copy it. Because it's not like you could, press a button that says place an order and sign a contract. They didn't have the money for it. And so the people themselves did it. And a lot of our emigre churches, it was parishioners to the best of their ability painting icons. In Canada, there are hundreds of churches, and they're trying to figure out what to do with them because the communities don't exist anymore, where they have these icons which we consider to be sacred. Now what do we do with them? Right? So I think that's actually a related issue. It's something to think about.
Well, in the EOC, like in the EOC, which is where I converted to Orthodoxy, we were so simple. We didn't know a lot, and some of the people became iconographers, but they were extremely simple.
Yeah.
Very simple. We didn't have a lot. We had the Theotokos and we had Christ. We had simple icon. We didn't have a lot. So when I come here, it's kind of new for me. To have all of that. Even though I was Catholic.
Yeah.
The Catholics more not as many icons as statues and stained glass and stuff like that. But I would like to know more about. Somebody to explain the icon.
Right.
And I think it would be good for our kids. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they already know, and I'm the one that doesn't.
I think they do some of them. Isn't there like a day where they do some of that already?
I don't know.
I can't remember, but they don't cover all of it.
Well, it would be nice to do, like one here and there, like not all of them at one time, because that would be overwhelming. But
Well, thank you.
thank you.
Is that helpful? Yes.
Oh yeah, I
Good. Very
very
good.
much enjoyed that.
Okay. Well, make arrangements to do it again.